Tenor is a bariatric mobile total lift for lifting up to 704-pound patients in all care situations. The Tenor is made of lightweight aluminum and is easy to maneuver into position. The Tenor is controlled via its handset. There are buttons to open and close the chassis legs and to raise and lower the hanger bar, with duplicate controls from the mast panel, which also has an emergency stop button. Before you approach the patient, be sure that your Tenor battery is charged. Make sure the green power button is depressed and press a button on the handset or column mast. The indicator light will show if the battery is green and charged, or if it needs to be replaced with the second battery unit. Also, be sure that you have a sling available before you approach the patient. There are a number of sling sizes available to suit all bariatric body shapes. The size of the patient's sling should be determined in advance and noted on the patient's assessment. The bariatric slings have an additional black band around the sling, which differentiates them from the regular slings. The color code for sizing remains unchanged. Plastic stays provide head support for the patient. Be sure that all stays are in place with the sling. The caregiver should always tell the patient what they are going to do. Where possible, always approach the patient from the front. To ensure maximum patient comfort, do not allow the patient to hold onto the spreader bar. Let's first look at lifting from a chair. Hold the sling up with the leg sections pointing downwards to identify the orientation of the sling. Place the sling around the patient so that the bottom of the back support area reaches the bottom of the patient's spine. It is not necessary to pull the sling under the patient. Pull each leg section under each thigh so that they emerge on the inside of the thighs. If the patient's thighs are large or have fragile skin, use a maxi slide sheet or orange maxi tube to help slide the leg sections under the thigh. Ensure the sling is not folded or twisted under the patient. The sling is attached to a new 4-point spreader bar designed specifically to enhance the comfort of bariatric residents and patients during lifting. Ensure that the Tenor is close enough to be able to attach the shoulder loops of the sling to the spreader bar. To accomplish this, you may have to put the patient's feet on or over the chassis. Ensure the widest side of the spreader bar is facing towards the patient and is at or just below shoulder level. If the slings supplied have more than one loop attachment position, attach whichever loop seems appropriate to the size of the patient. Once the Tenor is in position, attach the shoulder strap loops to the hooks on the spreader bar nearest the patient. The wider hookup points are for the shoulder sling loops, and the narrower hookup points are for the leg sling loops. It is not essential to apply the chassis brakes at this stage, as the position of the patient will adjust to his or her own center of gravity when lifted. If necessary, carefully lower the spreader bar a small amount using the control handset to enable the connection of the sling leg section loops, being careful not to lower it onto the patient. The leg section loop should be crossed over but not twisted so that the leg section loop connects to the opposite side hook. Raise the patient just high enough for the patient to be moved clear of the seat and ensure their feet are clear of the floor. Before transportation, turn the patient to face the attendant and lower the individual to approximately normal chair height. This gives confidence and dignity and also improves the Tenor mobility. Remember to release the brakes if they've been applied before attempting to transport the patient. Transportation should be done with the chassis legs closed, as it will be easier to push the lift through the doorway. The Tenor can be moved from the caregiver front or from the side, whichever is more convenient. When lowering the patient back into a chair or when transferring from bed to chair, ensure the patient is positioned in such a way so he or she is fully supported by the chair when he or she is lowered. If the patient is being moved to a bed, open the chassis legs as needed to avoid any obstacles like bed casters. It may also be easier to place the bed in a semi-reclined position before lowering, as the sling will be easier to remove. Once the patient is lowered to the bed, unhook the 4 sling loops, raise the lift to clear the patient, and safely pull the Tenor out of the way. Return to the patient and remove the sling from under the patient by pulling it clear of the legs and pulling up from the back if the patient is in a seated position, in bed, or in a chair. If the patient is flat on the bed, remove the patient sling by rolling the patient toward the caregiver. To lift from the bed, position the patient onto the sling by rolling the patient towards you, then folding the sling in half and placing it behind the patient's back. Position the sling carefully so that, when rolled back, the patient will lie on the center of the sling. Check that the head support area of the sling covers the patient's neck. When rolling the patient back onto the sling, roll the patient slightly in the opposite direction so that the folded part of the sling can be pulled forward. With heavy patients, the use of a slide sheet is recommended. Alternatively, the patient can be brought into a sitting posture, and we can position the sling from the back and under the legs as we did from a chair. With the tenor, approach the bed with the open side of the spreader bar towards the patient's head. Position the tenor so that the spreader bar is just above and centrally situated over the patient. Carefully lower the spreader bar until the shoulder attachment loops can be connected to the hooks nearest the patient's head. To make the lift more comfortable for the patient, it is recommended to elevate the head end of the bed to a semi-reclined position before commencing the lifting of the patient. When correctly connected, operate the control handset to raise the patient from the bed. At all times when lifting and lowering, it is advisable to stay at the side of the patient to ensure they're in a comfortable position. This is also reassuring for the patient. Lift the patient using the handset control and adjust to a comfortable reclined position for transfer. The specially designed sling, together with its integral head support, enables one person to carry out the complete lifting function without additional help. If returning the patient to a bed, move into the desired position above the bed, adjusting the sling position as necessary, then lower using the handset control. Only detach the sling leg connections, followed by the shoulder connections, when the patient's body weight is fully supported by the bed. Move the tenor away before removing the sling from under the patient. If transferring the patient to a chair, sit the patient up with the handset and lower the patient into the chair. Again, move the tenor away before removing the sling from under the patient. One of the most difficult manual patient transfer tasks is to lift a large patient from the floor. With the tenor, this task is much safer and easier. To lift from the floor, put the sling around the patient as before by rolling or sitting the patient up. Depending on circumstances, space, and position of the patient, approach the patient with the open part of the chassis. Open the chassis legs if necessary and lift the patient's legs over the chassis. While the patient is positioned over the legs, do not operate the leg actuator. When connecting the sling to the spreader bar, the patient's head and shoulders could be raised on pillows for comfort if required, but this is not essential. Attach the shoulder strap attachment loops. It will probably be easier to attach the longest loops. Some caregivers prefer to use a larger sling when lifting a patient from the floor. Bring each leg section of the sling under the patient's thighs using a maxi slide or tube if needed. The leg section loops should be crossed over but not twisted so that the leg section loop connects to the opposite side hook. Once securely connected, raise the patient carefully, staying in close proximity to the patient's legs at this stage of the lift to guide their legs safely over the lift until clear. Once raised from the floor, ensure the patient's legs are clear of the chassis before continuing to lift. Raise the patient to a suitable height for transport in a semi-recumbent position. Always check that all sling attachment loops are fully in position before and during the commencement of the lifting cycle and in tension as the patient's weight is gradually taken up, and that the sling loops are underneath and away from the safety latch on the hanger bar. If the leg sections of the sling tend to be fairly high in the crotch area, make adjustments for added comfort. The patient should be positioned in a chair or placed onto a bed in order to do this. If the patient is prone to extensor spasm, he or she may be lifted by the tenor, but special attention should be paid to supporting the legs during the lift. Staff assessments should be made to determine if a spastic or combative patient requires an additional caregiver to assist. If your tenor has a scale, it can be used as follows. Push the button marked with 0 to calibrate the weight unit to 0. Place patient in sling. Lift patient in sling with tenor. Stabilize the patient's movements. Push the button marked Operate. Read the patient's weight from the display. You can toggle between pounds and kilograms using the kilogram pounds button by keeping it pressed for 10 seconds. Otherwise, first, weigh the sling by first draping it on the hanger bar. Second, read the display. Third, calibrate the scale to 0. Fourth, lift the patient with the sling. Fifth, read the display to read the weight. Sixth, deduct the sling weight to learn the patient's net weight. Let's talk about some other details of the tenor. It has 2 rechargeable batteries and a charging station. The battery discharge indicator, located on the cover above the battery, shows how much power is left in the battery. It is best to change the batteries every 12 hours for maximum battery life. If the indicator shows amber, the battery should also be removed and charged. To remove the battery, push the button at the top of the battery pack, then pull it out carefully. The second charged battery can be inserted into the lift by placing the bottom in first and then pressing the top end in until secure. To charge the battery, take it to the charging station, carrying it firmly by its handle, and plug into the charger. If the battery is very low, it will take approximately 8 hours to charge. The service meter displays how much the unit has been utilized, allowing usage monitoring as well as a guide for important preventative maintenance scheduled procedures. As a safety backup, the tenor jib can be lowered manually. The tenor can be cleaned by wiping down with disinfectant. All surfaces should be wiped down between patients. There are many bariatric sling sizes and styles. Reusable slings can be surface cleaned and laundered as necessary. The tenor is a system that patients, residents, and caregivers can trust. Using this mobile lifter will considerably enhance the comfort and safety of those living and working in bariatric care.